Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is a J-Man Time, and today I have a video on some Portuguese weapons, infantry weapons that were used during the Portuguese Colonial Wars of the 1960s and 1970s. Between 1961 and 1974, Portugal fought a series of colonial engagements in Africa in order to maintain control of their colonial territory in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. These conflicts together were known as the Portuguese Colonial Conflict of 1961 through 1974. Now, during this conflict, the Portuguese military faced a variety of different anti-colonial groups. For example, the MPLA, the FNLA, the UNITA organization, the FLEC, PAIG or PAIGC, and the FRELIMO, and these were a collection of anti-colonial forces, mostly militia groups and insurgent forces that were fighting against the occupying Portuguese army. Portugal had control over Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique for nearly 500 years, for more than 500 years. In fact, the Portuguese colonial empire was one of the oldest empires still in existence during the Cold War. Now, during the Cold War, countries like the Soviet Union, China, Egypt, Libya, and even countries like the United States all funded various anti-colonial groups against the Portuguese government in Africa. Now, during the war, the Portuguese ordered a large number of weapons from various countries, mostly countries like Germany, West Germany, Belgium, and even the United States. So strangely enough, the US was kind of on both sides of the Portuguese colonial war to an extent. They also manufactured some of their own weapons, used many of their old World War I and II vintage weapons as second or third line weapons during this conflict. So let's go over the Portuguese weapons of the colonial war. Now, first let's go over the small arms, like submachine guns. And the first submachine gun is the FBP M948. This is a Portuguese-designed submachine gun that was based on a variety of different World War II era submachine guns, like the American M3 grease gun and the German MP40. These submachine guns were produced from 1948 until the 1970s, and they were chambered for the standard 9x19mm parabellum and were fed by a 32-round box magazine and had a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute. They were produced by the Portuguese armament company known as the Fabrícia de Barco de Prata, or the FBP for short, and they produced this as the standard submachine gun for the Portuguese armed forces, both on the mainland and for Portuguese troops serving in the colonial territories in Africa, and in the Azores, and in the Portuguese areas of China like Macau. Now, during the Portuguese Colonial War, these submachine guns were used as standard submachine guns. Now, the Portuguese did have access to foreign submachine guns, like the Israeli Uzi, for example. The Portuguese would later import Israeli Uzis and German-made copies of the Uzis later on during the Portuguese Colonial War, but the standard submachine gun remained the FBP M948 throughout most of the conflict. There was a second FBP submachine gun known as the M963 from 1963, and this was a Portuguese copy of the Belgian Vigneron submachine gun, which came out in the 1950s. It was also chambered for the same 9x19mm parabellum and had either a 32 to 36 round box magazine. The rate of fire on this weapon was between 500 and 650 rounds per minute, and it too was produced by the FBP, or the Fabrícia de Barco de Prata manufacturing company, from 1963 until the early 1970s, when it was replaced by more modern submachine guns. There were other submachine guns used. For example, I already mentioned the Israeli Uzi. The Uzi submachine gun was developed by the Israelis in 1947, and it would become the standard submachine gun of the Israeli forces all the way up into the 1980s with the introduction of the micro Uzi and other submachine gun variants imported from other countries. The Uzi in Portuguese service was known as the Metralhadora M961 and served in the Portuguese Army and Colonial Army all the way up until the 1990s, actually. Even after the Colonial War ended, the Portuguese continued to use the Uzi submachine gun until they developed their own submachine gun known as the Lusa later on in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Let's go over some rifles that were used during the Portuguese Colonial War. Now, the standard rifle used by Portuguese forces during the conflict was the German G3 battle rifle, known as the Espingarda M961 in Portuguese. In the 1960s, Portugal ordered some Heckler & Koch made G3 battle rifles from Germany, and these would become the standard issue rifles for the Portuguese throughout the entire Portuguese Colonial War. Now, later on, the Portuguese got the rights to manufacture this rifle, and again, it was manufactured by the FBP factory. In Portugal, it was known as the Espingarda M961, and it was manufactured along with the Heckler & Koch HK-21 light machine gun, or in Portuguese, the Metralhadora M968. And these two German-made weapons would become the standard-issued rifle and squad automatic light machine gun during the Portuguese Colonial War, along with other older light machine guns like the German MG42 and the Danish Madsen light machine gun, which were still in use by the Portuguese throughout the entirety of the colonial conflict, which didn't end until 1974. Another rifle used by the Portuguese during the conflict was the American AR-10. The AR-10 was a select-fire battle rifle developed by the Armalite Company in 1956, and later on, Portugal would purchase some AR-10s from the Netherlands. So these were the Dutch AR-10 variants that were purchased first from the US. These were Dutch rifles that were purchased from the US. These are special ordered rifles purchased from the US, and they were later sold to Portugal in 1962, and they would become the third line rifle used by the Portuguese during the Portuguese Colonial War. These AR-10s were mostly used by Portuguese paratroopers and the paratrooper regiments, along with the next rifle on the list, the Belgian FN-FAL. The AR-10s were chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO and had a 20-round box magazine and a rate of fire of 700 rounds per minute. Now, the Portuguese liked the weapon as it was lighter than the G3 rifle and the FN-FAL, but they were never able to get any more of these rifles from either the Dutch or the Americans, and they never gained the rights to manufacture the rifle in Portugal. Eventually, these rifles were phased out in the late 1970s for more modern NATO rifles after the fall of the Salazar government in 1974. As mentioned earlier, another rifle that served with the Portuguese forces during the Colonial War was the Belgian FN-FAL, known as the Espingarda M962 in Portugal. Portugal managed to get some of these weapons from both Belgium and West Germany starting in the early 1960s, and they would become the secondary weapon used by Portuguese forces along with the German-made and Portuguese-made G3 battle rifle. Just like the G3 and the AR-10, it was two-chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge. The Portuguese used both the semi-automatic version and the select-fire version, and the select-fire version had a rate of fire of 700 rounds per minute. And just like the G3, it was a pretty good rifle, and the Portuguese liked it so much they continued using the FN-FAL for a few years after the Portuguese Colonial War ended in 1974. Another older rifle that was used by the Portuguese colonial troops during the Colonial War was the Mauser Vaquero from 1904. This was an old bolt-action rifle that was the standard rifle for the Portuguese armed forces during the First World War and during the Second World War. The rifle was developed in 1904 and was chambered for the standard 6.5 by 58mm Vaquero, which was a standard issue cartridge in Portugal. It had a 5-round internal magazine and an average firing range of about 1,000 yards. There was also a second version known as the M1939, and the M1939 was chambered for the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, or the German 8mm Mauser cartridge, and still had a 5-round internal magazine. Now, these weapons were leftovers from the Second World War and were still in use by Portuguese colonial forces up until at least 1965. By 1965, they were mostly replaced by the FNFAL, the G3 battle rifle, and the AR-10 series of select fire battle rifles. But these weapons were also captured by anti-colonial forces and insurgent groups during the conflict, and were still in use to some capacity during the post-war era when Angola and Mozambique would later collapse into civil war following the exodus of Portuguese forces in 1974. So these rifles were used for a pretty long time after the conflict, and were the oldest rifles in use during the Portuguese Colonial War. And then that brings us to the last weapon on the list, and this weapon here was developed by an Italian. It is the Lanca Factis, the 37mm, which was a Portuguese light anti-personnel or shoulder-fired anti-personnel rocket launcher developed in 1962. The weapon was actually developed by an Italian journalist by the name of Cesare Dante Vacchi, and Vacchi was tagging along with the Portuguese Caçador Battalion 280, which was a Portuguese infantry battalion in the early 1960s, and he came up with this nifty shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher. It is one of the smallest and lightest calibered bazooka-type rocket launchers to be developed in the Cold War era. It was basically a miniature bazooka in a sense. It was chambered for the 37 by 100mm SNEB anti-personnel rockets, which were basically rocket grenades or rocket-powered grenade rounds. So it was basically like a rocket-powered or bazooka-type grenade launcher, and it was used by Portuguese forces throughout the entire conflict, and was even captured and used by some of the anti-colonial forces and insurgent forces during the conflict. Now, outside of anti-personnel use, it really didn't have much use outside of the anti-personnel role, as the tiny 37mm rocket could not really penetrate the armor of most of the heavy and medium armored vehicles being used in the conflict. But it was still a useful light anti-personnel weapon and anti-fortification weapon that was developed by an Italian for the Portuguese armed forces, and is one of the strangest weapons used by Portugal during the conflict. These were some of the weapons used during the Colonial War. Now, there were some other weapons that were used. Many of these are also rare. Another weapon that was used by the Portuguese was the German MG-13. This was actually a 1930s vintage light machine gun that was based on a World War I light machine gun used by German pilots. The Portuguese would purchase some of these weapons during the Second World War, and they were given the name Metralhadora M938, and these would serve in the Portuguese armed forces during the Colonial War also. The Portuguese also imported other German and Italian light machine guns, light and heavy machine guns, including the German MG-42, known as the Metralhadora M944, the Italian Breda model 1931 light machine gun, known as the M938 in Portugal, and the post-war era MG-42-59 light machine gun. They would also import some American M2 Browning machine guns, known as the M-951 in Portugal, the aforementioned HK-21 series of light machine guns, known as the M-968 in Portugal, and even some old pre-World War I and pre-World War II era Madsen light machine guns that were also used by the Portuguese during the Colonial War. So the Portuguese used a variety of different weapons. Some were very modern, like the G3 battle rifle, at least for the time, and the American AR-10, and some were very antiquated, like the MG-13 and the Madsen light machine gun. So what do you all think of these weapons? Please tell me in the comment section below. If I had to choose, my favorite is clearly the 37mm rocket launcher, as that is the strangest one out of the weapons used by the Portuguese. But which are your favorite? Please tell me in the comment section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.
é formar unidades de grande mobilidade e especialistas em técnicas de combate e contra-guerrilha, capazes de uma inovação permanente em qualquer dos 3 teatros de guerra em África.
Fala a voz do comando. Vai ser submetido a uma instrução especial, vinda a qual receberás o título Comando. Contamos com a generosidade do teu temperamento e com o teu espírito de sacrifício, que serão constantemente postos à prova, para que ao longo dos sacrifícios, fadigas, dores e riscos por que vais passar, te possamos considerar digno do título Comando. Só 1 em 100